Hey everyone, welcome back to another journey through history's greatest hits of human suffering. Tonight we're exploring the glamorous world of medieval peasantry, where job security meant you'd definitely be miserable tomorrow, and your career advancement opportunities consisted of maybe not dying this winter. Before we dive into this tale of agricultural despair, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy falling asleep to stories of historical hardship, and subscribe only if you genuinely want more content about why the past was terrible for everyone except kings and bishops. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing who's joining me for these midnight misery sessions. Now settle in, maybe grab a snack that wasn't grown in manure-fertilized fields by people who own nothing but the fleas in their hair, and let's explore why being a medieval peasant was essentially a lifetime subscription to poverty, starvation, and backbreaking labor with no possibility of cancellation. Chapter 1. Welcome to serfdom. You own nothing and nothing owns you. Let's start with the basic structure of medieval peasant life, which was designed by people who clearly believed that human suffering was character building, and that the best way to organize society was to make sure 90% of the population lived in constant misery while 10% lived in luxury built on that misery. Medieval peasants fell into several categories of wretchedness. At the bottom were serfs, who were essentially slaves tied to the land they worked but didn't own. They couldn't leave their lord's estate without permission, couldn't marry without approval, and couldn't even die without their lord claiming a portion of their possessions as a death tax. It was like having the world's worst mortgage, except instead of eventually owning your house, you just worked until you died and then your children got to inherit your debt. Villains were slightly better off serfs who might own a small plot of land and some tools, but they still owed massive obligations to their lord. They had to work the lord's land for several days each week for free, pay various taxes and fees, and provide military service when required. Imagine having a job where you work 3 days a week for no pay, then spend the rest of your time trying to grow enough food to not starve, while also owing your boss money for the privilege of existing. Free peasants were theoretically better off because they owned their land, but they still owed taxes, military service, and various feudal obligations to their lord. Plus, they had to compete economically with serfs who worked for free, which made their freedom about as valuable as a chocolate teapot. Freedom in medieval times mostly meant the freedom to starve independently. The manor system was designed to be completely self-sufficient, which sounds sustainable until you realize it meant peasants were trapped in an economic bubble with no opportunities for advancement, trade, or escape. Everything you needed had to be produced locally, and everything you produced belonged ultimately to your lord. It was like living in the world's worst company town, except the company owned your soul and your descendants' souls in perpetuity. Land ownership was the foundation of medieval power, and peasants owned virtually no land despite doing all the actual work. The lord owned the fields, the forests, the streams, the mills, and often even the ovens where bread was baked. Peasants paid to use everything they needed to survive, creating a system where the people who did all the labor received almost none of the benefits. Legal status as a serf was inherited, meaning children were born into bondage based on their parents' status. You couldn't work your way out of serfdom, couldn't buy your freedom, and couldn't run away without becoming an outlaw. Social mobility existed in theory but was practically impossible. It was a caste system disguised as feudal obligation. The lord's rights over his peasants were extensive and invasive. He could control who they married, where they lived, what crops they grew, and even how they spent their free time. Peasants needed permission for major life decisions and could be punished for making choices their lord disapproved of. It was like having a boss who micromanaged every aspect of your existence while paying you in barely enough food to survive. Village life was communal by necessity, not choice. Peasants shared tools, labor, and resources because no individual family could afford everything needed for survival. This created tight-knit communities, but also meant that individual privacy and independence were virtually impossible. Your neighbors knew everything about your life because their survival depended on your cooperation and vice versa. The relationship between lord and peasant was supposedly based on mutual obligation. Peasants owed labor and loyalty, while lords owed protection and justice. In practice, lords held all the power and peasants provided all the work while receiving minimal protection and arbitrary justice. It was a protection racket disguised as social contract, where the people being protected were being protected primarily from their protector. Chapter 2. A day in the life of agricultural hell. Let's walk through a typical day in the life of a medieval peasant, keeping in mind that typical meant variations of the same basic theme. Wake up tired, work until exhausted, eat inadequate food, and collapse into bed hoping tomorrow wouldn't be worse. The peasant day began before dawn, not because early rising was virtuous, but because there was too much work to fit into daylight hours. Roosters were the medieval alarm clock, except roosters don't have snooze buttons, and ignoring them meant your lord's bailiff might show up to discuss your work ethic with a stick. Morning tasks started with tending to animals if you were lucky enough to own any. A peasant family might have a few chickens, a pig, maybe a cow if they were relatively prosperous. These animals lived in or adjacent to the family home, because heated barns were a luxury and animal body heat helped warm the house. Wake up each morning to the smell of your roommate animals, and their digestive processes was just part of medieval life. Breakfast, when it existed, consisted of whatever leftover bread or porridge was available from the previous day. Many peasants started their workday on an empty stomach, planning to eat when there was a natural break in the labor. Hunger was a constant companion that shaped every decision and every moment of the day. The bulk of the morning was spent working the Lord's land, fulfilling the labor obligations that came with being a serf. This wasn't volunteer work or paid employment. It was forced labor that had to be completed before peasants could work their own small plots. The best hours of the day, when energy levels were highest, were spent enriching the Lord while the peasants' own crops waited. Field work was backbreaking labor performed with primitive tools. Plows were heavy wooden implements that required enormous strength to operate, and not every peasant family could afford oxen to pull them. Human-powered agriculture meant bending, lifting, digging, and hauling all day long in conditions that would violate every modern workplace safety regulation. Weather was both blessing and curse for peasant farmers. Rain was necessary for crops but made field work miserable and dangerous. Sun was needed for growth but created exhausting heat during harvest season. There was no indoor work to retreat to during storms, no air conditioning for hot days, and no weather forecasts to plan around. Peasants worked outside in all conditions because the alternative was starvation. Midday meals, when possible, were eaten in the fields to maximize working time. This might consist of bread, cheese if available, and ale or water. The meal break was brief because daylight was precious and seasonal deadlines waited for no one. Eating while working was common, though it made both activities less pleasant. Afternoon work continued the morning's labor, more plowing, planting, weeding, or harvesting depending on the season. The physical demands were relentless, and tools were crude and inefficient. A task that modern machinery could complete in minutes might take a peasant family days to accomplish by hand. Tool maintenance was a constant necessity and expense. Wooden handles broke, metal blades dulled, and equipment wore out rapidly under heavy use. Peasants had to repair or replace their tools regularly, often with materials they couldn't afford and skills they had to learn through trial and error. Evening brought more chores rather than rest. Animals needed feeding and care, household tasks awaited, and preparation for the next day's work was necessary. There was always more work than time, and exhaustion was the normal state of existence rather than something to be avoided or recovered from. The workday ended when darkness made outdoor labor impossible, not when peasants felt they had accomplished enough. Candles and oil for lamps were expensive luxuries, so most peasant families went to bed shortly after sunset and woke before sunrise. Their schedule was determined entirely by the sun and the seasons. Sleep came easily to people who had performed physical labor for 12 to 14 hours, but rest was often interrupted by cold, hunger, or sick animals. The quality of sleep was poor due to inadequate bedding, drafty homes, and the constant worry about tomorrow's obligations. Even rest was tainted by the stress of peasant life. Chapter 3: Farming with Stone Age Technology. Medieval agriculture was practiced with tools and techniques that had barely evolved since ancient times, creating a situation where peasants worked harder than anyone in human history while producing barely enough food to survive. It was like trying to compete in modern Formula One racing with a horse and cart. The medieval plow was a wooden beam with a metal tip, pulled by oxen if you were lucky, or by humans if you weren't. Oxen were expensive to buy and maintain, so many peasant families had to borrow or rent them, paying yet another fee to the lord who monopolized ownership of necessary equipment. The plow itself was heavy, unwieldy, and inefficient, requiring multiple passes over the same ground to achieve what modern equipment does in a single pass. Seed quality was generally poor because peasants had to save seeds from their own harvest, selecting from plants that had survived the previous year's challenges rather than thriving. There was no understanding of plant breeding or genetics, so crop quality stagnated or declined over generations. Bad seeds produced weak plants produced poor harvests, and poor harvests meant less food and worse seeds for next year. Fertilizer consisted entirely of animal manure, which was valuable enough to cause disputes between neighbors. Human waste was also used because medieval peasants understood that waste had to go somewhere and plants seemed to grow better where waste had been applied. The connection between waste and soil fertility was empirical rather than scientific, but it worked even if it made everything smell terrible. Irrigation was primitive when it existed at all. Most peasant farming depended entirely on natural rainfall, making agriculture a gamble against weather patterns that were unpredictable and often devastating. Drought meant crop failure and starvation. Too much rain meant flooding and crop failure and starvation. There was a very narrow band of weather conditions that produced adequate harvests. Crop rotation was practiced in a crude three-field system that left 1/3 of arable land fallow each year. This was necessary to maintain soil fertility, but it meant that productive capacity was always artificially limited. Modern farming techniques can keep land in continuous production, but medieval peasants had to sacrifice 1/3 of their potential crop area to prevent soil exhaustion. Harvesting was done entirely by hand with sickles and scythes, making it labor-intensive and time-sensitive. Grain had to be cut at exactly the right time, too early and it wouldn't be ripe, too late and it would fall from the stalks and be lost. Weather during harvest season could destroy an entire year's work in a matter of days, and there was no way to speed up the process. Threshing, separating grain from stalks, was accomplished by beating the harvested crops with wooden flails. This was tedious, physically demanding work that had to be done carefully to avoid damaging the grain. A family might spend weeks threshing their annual harvest, working from dawn to dusk in dusty, uncomfortable conditions. Storage of harvested grain was a constant challenge in an era without proper containers or pest control. Mice, rats, insects, and mold destroyed significant portions of stored food, sometimes making the difference between survival and starvation during winter months. Peasants had to build storage areas, guard against pests, and ration carefully to make their harvest last until the next growing season. Weather prediction was based on folk wisdom, religious observations, and pure guesswork. Peasants might plant or harvest based on phases of the moon, behavior of animals, or traditional calendar dates, but they had no reliable way to anticipate storms, droughts, or unseasonable temperature changes. Agricultural planning was essentially gambling with the family's survival as stakes. Crop diseases and pest infestations could destroy entire harvests without warning. Peasants had no scientific understanding of plant pathology and no effective treatments for sick crops. When blight, rust, or insects attacked their fields, peasants could only watch their year's work die and hope they had enough stored food to survive until the next planting season. Tool quality was inconsistent and repair was difficult. Metal was expensive and skilled blacksmiths were not always available, so peasants often worked with tools that were poorly made, inadequately maintained, or improvised from whatever materials were available. Broken tools during critical agricultural periods could mean the difference between a successful harvest and disaster. Chapter 4: The Taxation Nightmare. If working the land with primitive tools wasn't challenging enough, medieval peasants also had to navigate a taxation system designed by people who apparently believed that the best way to motivate agricultural workers was to take away most of what they produced. The most basic tax was the tithe, supposedly a voluntary contribution to the church that was actually mandatory and enforced with threats of eternal damnation. Peasants owed 1/10 of their harvest to the local priest, regardless of whether the harvest was adequate for their family's survival. The church's needs took priority over peasant starvation, because spiritual welfare was more important than physical welfare. Labor obligations were another form of taxation, requiring peasants to work the Lord's land for several days each week without compensation. These weren't optional community service projects. They were legal obligations that could be enforced with physical punishment. Peasants had to complete their labor obligations before working their own fields, ensuring that the Lord's harvest took priority over their own survival. Marriage taxes, called merchet, were charged when peasant women married. The Lord collected payment for losing a worker, because women and their labor belonged to the estate where they were born. Marriage wasn't just a personal decision. It was an economic transaction that required the Lord's approval and payment of appropriate fees. Death taxes, known as Harriet, claimed the best animal or most valuable possession when a peasant died. This was supposedly compensation for the Lord's investment in training and supporting the deceased peasant, but it was really just another way to prevent peasants from accumulating wealth or passing it to their children. Death was not only an ending but also a financial catastrophe for the surviving family. Mill taxes required peasants to grind their grain at the Lord's mill and pay for the privilege. Building private mills was forbidden, creating a monopoly that generated revenue for the Lord while adding costs for peasants who were already struggling to afford food. Even processing your own grain into flour required paying tribute to the feudal system. Forest taxes controlled access to wood, game, and other forest resources. Peasants needed wood for fuel, construction, and tools, but collecting it from the Lord's forest required permission and payment. Poaching deer or other game was punishable by death, even if peasants were starving and the Lord's forests were full of food. Market taxes were charged for selling produce at local markets. Peasants who managed to grow surplus crops had to pay for the privilege of selling them, reducing their profit and discouraging agricultural innovation. The Lord collected fees from both buyers and sellers, profiting from transactions while contributing nothing to the agricultural production. Road tolls were charged for transporting goods across the Lord's territory. Moving crops to market, visiting family in other villages, or traveling for any purpose required payment of transportation fees. The road system was essentially a series of privately owned toll booths that made travel expensive and complicated for people who had very little money. Court fees were charged for legal proceedings, dispute resolution, and administrative services. Peasants who were cheated, injured, or wronged had to pay for access to justice, and the Lord who profited from their labor also profited from resolving their disputes. Justice was not only blind but also expensive and controlled by the same people who created most of the problems requiring legal resolution. Special taxes were levied for wars, royal visits, castle construction, and other expenses that benefited the Lord rather than the peasants. These extraordinary taxes came on top of regular obligations and were often imposed without warning during agricultural seasons when peasants could least afford additional expenses. Tax collection was enforced by bailiffs and reeves who had the authority to seize property, imprison delinquent taxpayers, and impose additional penalties for late payment. The tax system was backed by violence and the threat of violence, making compliance mandatory regardless of peasants' ability to pay while meeting their survival needs. Record-keeping for tax purposes was done by clerks who worked for the Lord, creating a system where taxpayers had no independent verification of what they owed or what they had already paid. Disputes over tax obligations were resolved by the same authority that imposed the taxes, ensuring that conflicts were decided in favor of the tax collector. Chapter 5. Medieval Weather: Nature's Attempt at Population Control. Medieval climate was particularly harsh during what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that made agricultural life even more challenging than it already was. Weather wasn't just an inconvenience for medieval peasants. It was a matter of life and death that determined whether families would eat or starve. Winter lasted roughly 6 months in much of medieval Europe, during which outdoor agricultural work was impossible and stored food had to sustain entire families. Peasant homes were poorly insulated wooden structures with gaps that let in wind, rain, and snow. Heating came from open fires that consumed enormous amounts of wood while providing minimal warmth and filling homes with smoke. Fuel for heating was expensive and labor-intensive to obtain. Peasants had to cut, transport, and store enough wood to last through winter, often working during autumn when they should have been harvesting crops. The Lord's forests were off-limits without permission and payment, so fuel scarcity was a constant problem that forced difficult choices between warmth and food. Winter clothing was inadequate for the climate. Peasants wore wool when they could afford it, linen when they couldn't, and often wrapped themselves in animal skins or whatever materials were available. Multiple family members shared beds and bedding to conserve body heat, and many peasants suffered from cold-related injuries like frostbite throughout the winter months. Spring was a time of cautious optimism mixed with desperate hunger, as food stores from the previous harvest ran low and new crops were still months away from maturity. The period between late winter and early summer was known as the hungry gap, when peasant families survived on whatever they could forage, beg, or steal while waiting for their gardens to produce food. Flooding was a regular spring hazard that could destroy crops, homes, and stored food supplies. Medieval drainage systems were primitive or non-existent, so heavy spring rains often turned agricultural areas into temporary lakes. Peasants whose fields flooded lost not only their current crops, but also their seeds for replanting, creating economic disasters that could last for years. Late frosts could kill young plants after peasants had already committed their seed supplies to planting. Weather prediction was impossible, so planting decisions were essentially gambling with survival. Plant too early and risk frost damage. Plant too late and risk not having enough growing season for crops to mature before winter returned. Summer droughts were devastating for communities that depended entirely on rain-fed agriculture. Medieval peasants had no irrigation systems, no deep wells, and no way to transport water over long distances. When summer rains failed, crops withered in the fields and peasants faced the prospect of another year without adequate food supplies. Hailstorms could destroy entire harvests in minutes, reducing months of labor to shredded plants and ruined grain. There was no insurance, no government assistance, and no way to recover from weather-related agricultural disasters except to start over the following year and hope for better conditions. Extreme heat during harvest season made agricultural work dangerous and exhausting. Peasants had to cut grain by hand during the hottest part of summer, working from dawn to dusk in conditions that would be considered unsafe by modern standards. Heat exhaustion and dehydration were common, but the harvest couldn't wait for more comfortable weather. Autumn windstorms could knock down ripe grain before it could be harvested, scattering the precious food across the fields where it would rot or be eaten by animals. High winds also damaged buildings, destroyed stored food, and created additional repair work during the busy harvest season. Weather-related disasters created famine conditions that could last for multiple years. When crops failed, peasants had nothing to eat and nothing to plant for the following year. Famine weakened people's resistance to disease, leading to epidemic cycles that killed large portions of the population during particularly bad weather years. Climate unpredictability meant that peasants could never plan effectively for weather challenges. What worked one year might fail catastrophically the next, and there was no way to predict or prepare for weather patterns that varied dramatically from season to season and year to year. Chapter 6: The Social Hierarchy of Suffering. Medieval peasants existed at the bottom of a social hierarchy designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum benefits. Understanding this system helps explain why peasant life was so consistently miserable. It was designed that way by people who profited from peasant labor. The lord of the manor was the local ruler who owned the land, controlled the peasants, and extracted wealth from their labor. Lords lived in castles or manor houses, ate fine food, wore expensive clothing, and enjoyed luxuries that peasants could never afford. The lord's lifestyle was directly subsidized by peasant suffering, creating a system where inequality was not just tolerated but institutionalized. Knights were professional warriors who served the lord in exchange for grants of land and peasant labor. Knights didn't work in the agricultural sense. Their job was to fight, hunt, and maintain their military equipment while peasants produced the food and wealth that supported their lifestyle. Knights saw peasants as barely human resources to be exploited rather than fellow Christians deserving of dignity. The clergy formed another privileged class that lived off peasant labor while providing spiritual services of questionable value. Priests collected tithes, controlled education and literacy, and reinforced the social hierarchy by teaching that poverty was virtuous and that peasants should accept their suffering as God's will. Religion was used as a tool of social control that kept peasants compliant. Village officials like reeves and bailiffs were usually peasants who had been promoted to administrative positions, but their job was to serve the lord's interests rather than represent their fellow peasants. These positions created division within peasant communities by giving some peasants authority over others while making them responsible for enforcing unpopular policies. Merchants and craftsmen occupied a middle position in the social hierarchy, better off than agricultural peasants but still subject to feudal obligations. These individuals might own small amounts of property and have specialized skills, but they were also dependent on peasant agricultural production and vulnerable to economic disruption. Women peasants faced additional disadvantages within an already oppressive system. They had fewer legal rights than men, couldn't inherit property under most circumstances, and were subject to their father's or husband's authority in all major decisions. Women did the same agricultural work as men while also bearing and raising children, managing households, and dealing with gender-specific forms of exploitation. Children were economic assets rather than individuals with rights or needs. Peasant children began working as soon as they were physically capable, often by age 5 or 6. Education was not available and wouldn't have been practical anyway. Peasant children needed to learn agricultural skills and contribute to family survival rather than waste time on reading and writing. The elderly and disabled had no social safety net and depended entirely on family support for survival. Peasants who became too old or sick to work faced starvation unless their relatives could support them, creating additional economic pressure on families that were already struggling to meet basic needs. Social mobility was theoretically possible but practically non-existent. A peasant might become a priest, soldier, or merchant through extraordinary circumstances, but the vast majority lived and died in the same social position where they were born. The social hierarchy was designed to be permanent, not merit-based. Marriage alliances were arranged to benefit families economically rather than to satisfy individual preferences. Peasant marriages were business transactions aimed at combining resources, acquiring labor, or fulfilling feudal obligations. Love was considered irrelevant to marriage decisions that were too important to be left to individual choice. Legal rights for peasants were minimal and subject to the lord's discretion. Peasants could not vote, could not own significant property, could not leave their lord's territory without permission, and had no legal recourse against abuse by their social superiors. Justice was administered by the same people who profited from peasant oppression. Conclusion: why peasant life was humanity's longest nightmare. As we wrap up our tour through the special hell that was medieval peasant life, it's worth reflecting on the fact that this wasn't a brief historical aberration. This was the normal human condition for roughly 1,000 years. Millions of people lived and died in this system, working themselves to death to enrich a small elite while receiving barely enough to survive. The medieval peasant experience represents the logical conclusion of a social system designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few while extracting maximum labor from everyone else. It worked exactly as intended. Lords became wealthy and powerful while peasants remained poor and powerless, generation after generation. Modern complaints about work-life balance, income inequality, and economic opportunity pale in comparison to the medieval peasant experience. Today's minimum wage worker has freedoms, protections, and opportunities that medieval peasants couldn't even imagine. Social mobility, education, healthcare, and basic human rights are modern inventions that didn't exist for most of human history. The end of serfdom came gradually through economic changes, plague outbreaks that created labor shortages, and peasant rebellions that forced social change. But it took centuries for feudalism to collapse, and even then, agricultural workers continued to face exploitation and poverty well into the modern era. So the next time you're stuck in traffic complaining about your job, your taxes, or your boss, remember that you're not tied to the land by law, you're not required to work for free several days a week, and you won't be charged a tax for getting married or punished by death for hunting deer when you're hungry. Medieval peasant life was a masterclass in human endurance under impossible conditions. These people survived, worked, raised families, and maintained communities despite facing challenges that would break most modern people. Their suffering wasn't noble or character-building, it was just suffering. But their perseverance in the face of systematic oppression is worth remembering, even if we're grateful we'll never have to experience it ourselves. Sleep well tonight, knowing that tomorrow you won't wake up before dawn to work someone else's land with primitive tools, that your food wasn't grown in manure and harvested by hand, and that nobody owns you as property. Medieval peasant life makes almost any modern problem seem manageable by comparison. Thanks for joining me on this journey through agricultural misery. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this descent into feudal hell, and let me know in the comments what other historical nightmares you'd like me to explore. Until next time, stay grateful for modern life, and remember, you're living better than 99% of all humans who have ever existed. Medieval peasants lived in conditions that were basically designed to cultivate disease and spread infection as efficiently as possible. Their understanding of hygiene was minimal, their access to medical care was non-existent, and their lifestyle choices were limited to whatever wouldn't immediately kill them. Personal hygiene was a luxury that peasants couldn't afford and didn't understand. Bathing was rare because soap was expensive, hot water required fuel that was needed for cooking, and the prevailing medical theory suggested that frequent bathing opened the pores to disease. Most peasants went months without washing their entire body, developing layers of dirt, grease, and dead skin that served as breeding grounds for parasites. Clothing was rarely washed because peasants owned so few garments that they couldn't spare them for cleaning. The same tunic and hose might be worn for weeks or months, accumulating sweat, dirt, food stains, and bodily fluids until they became stiff with accumulated filth. Lice, fleas, and other parasites lived in peasant clothing, creating mobile ecosystems of discomfort and disease transmission. Housing conditions were perfect for breeding illness. Peasant homes were small, windowless structures shared with extended families and farm animals. The floor was usually dirt, the roof leaked, and ventilation was poor. Multiple family members shared the same sleeping space, ensuring that when one person got sick, everyone else would follow shortly. Water quality was consistently terrible because peasants didn't understand the connection between contaminated water and disease. They drank from the same streams where they dumped waste, washed clothes, and watered animals. Wells were often contaminated by nearby latrines, creating a perfect system for spreading waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery. Food safety was a foreign concept in an era without refrigeration or understanding of food preservation. Meat was often partially spoiled before cooking, dairy products soured quickly, and grain storage was contaminated by rodents and insects. Peasants ate whatever food was available, regardless of its condition, because the alternative was starvation. Dental care consisted of pulling out teeth when they became too painful to bear. Peasants had no toothbrushes, no dental floss, and no understanding of oral hygiene. Tooth decay was universal, leading to abscesses, infections, and facial swelling that could spread to the brain and cause death. Bad breath was the least of their dental problems. Waste disposal was handled with the sophistication you'd expect from people who thought disease was caused by bad air and imbalanced humors. Human waste was dumped in rivers, spread on fields as fertilizer, or simply thrown out the door. This created a constant cycle of contamination that ensured disease would spread efficiently throughout peasant communities. Epidemics swept through peasant villages regularly, killing significant portions of the population with diseases that are now easily preventable or treatable. Smallpox, influenza, plague, typhus, and dysentery would appear without warning and spread rapidly through communities with no understanding of quarantine or disease prevention. Medical treatment consisted of folk remedies, prayer, and hoping the disease would go away on its own. Peasants couldn't afford physicians and wouldn't have trusted them anyway, since medical treatment often made patients worse. They relied on village-wise women, herbal remedies, and religious rituals that had no actual medical benefit. Childbirth was extraordinarily dangerous for both mothers and babies. Women gave birth in unsanitary conditions with no medical assistance, leading to high rates of maternal mortality from infection, hemorrhage, and complications that could have been easily prevented with basic medical knowledge. Infant mortality was so common that many families didn't name children until they survived their first year. Life expectancy for peasants was roughly 30 years, with death coming from disease, injury, malnutrition, or simple exhaustion. Those who survived childhood faced a lifetime of poor health, chronic pain, and physical limitations that would be considered disabilities today. Good health was so rare that it was considered miraculous rather than normal. Chapter 8: Food and Famine When Hunger Was a Way of Life. Medieval peasants lived in a constant state of nutritional uncertainty, where the difference between a good harvest and mass starvation could depend on a week of bad weather or a swarm of locusts. Their diet was monotonous, nutritionally inadequate, and frequently interrupted by periods of genuine famine. The basic peasant diet consisted primarily of bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables could be grown in small garden plots. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions, or when an animal died and had to be consumed quickly before it spoiled. Most peasants went weeks or months without eating meat, getting their protein from beans, peas, and occasionally eggs from their chickens. Bread quality varied dramatically based on social status and economic conditions. White bread made from wheat flour was reserved for the wealthy, while peasants ate dark bread made from rye, barley, oats, or whatever grain was available. During famines, bread might be extended with sawdust, ground acorns, or even clay to make the flour last longer. The expression daily bread was literal for people who often had nothing else to eat. Seasonal eating was not a trendy dietary choice but a survival necessity. Peasants ate whatever was available when it was available, gorging themselves during harvest season and slowly starving during the late winter and early spring. Fresh fruits and vegetables were only available for a few months each year, leading to widespread nutritional deficiencies and diseases like scurvy. Food preservation techniques were limited and often resulted in food that was barely edible. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried until it became leathery and nearly flavorless. Vegetables were pickled in brine or stored in root cellars where they slowly rotted. Dairy products were turned into cheese or allowed to ferment into substances that modern food safety inspectors would condemn without hesitation. Cooking methods were primitive and fuel-intensive. Most peasant families cooked over open fires that consumed enormous amounts of wood and produced food that was often burned on the outside and raw on the inside. Ovens were community resources owned by the lord, requiring peasants to pay fees to bake their bread and creating another source of feudal taxation. Hunger was a constant companion that shaped every decision and every aspect of peasant life. Chronic malnutrition left peasants weak, susceptible to disease, and unable to perform the heavy labor required for agricultural survival. Children were permanently stunted by inadequate nutrition, creating generations of people who were physically smaller and weaker than properly fed populations. Famine struck medieval Europe regularly, killing between 10% and 25% of the population during severe episodes. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was particularly devastating, lasting 7 years and killing millions of people across northern Europe. During famines, peasants ate grass, bark, roots, and anything else that might provide calories, often poisoning themselves with toxic plants. Food riots and social unrest were common during periods of scarcity, as hungry peasants attacked grain stores, mills, and markets in desperate attempts to find food. Lords and merchants would hoard grain during famines, driving up prices and profiting from peasants' suffering. The wealthy continued to eat well while peasants starved, creating resentment that occasionally exploded into violent rebellion. Cannibalism occurred during the worst famines, though it was rarely discussed openly. Desperate families would consume the bodies of those who had already died from starvation, and there are documented cases of people killing and eating strangers or even family members. These extreme measures were seen as temporary insanity brought on by starvation rather than moral failings. Religious explanations for famine blamed peasant sins for God's wrath, encouraging communities to focus on prayer and repentance rather than practical solutions like food distribution or agricultural improvement. The church collected tithes even during famines, prioritizing religious obligations over human survival and contributing to the death toll through institutional selfishness. Recovery from famines took years or decades, as communities had to rebuild their agricultural capacity while dealing with reduced populations and lingering health problems from malnutrition. Survivors often suffered permanent physical and psychological damage from extended starvation, creating lasting impacts that affected entire generations. Chapter 9: Violence and Lawlessness, when justice was just another form of oppression. Medieval peasant life was saturated with violence, both from the brutal feudal system and from the desperate conditions that turned ordinary people into dangerous criminals. Justice was arbitrary, punishment was savage, and safety was a luxury that peasants couldn't afford. Domestic violence was endemic in peasant households, where stress, hunger, and desperation created explosive situations with no social services or legal protections for victims. Men who felt powerless in their dealings with lords and officials often took out their frustrations on their wives and children, creating cycles of abuse that were considered normal parts of family life. Village disputes over property, resources, or personal slights could escalate into blood feuds that lasted for generations. Without effective legal systems or law enforcement, peasants settled conflicts through violence, creating communities where everyone was potentially dangerous and grudges were passed down from parents to children like family heirlooms. Bandits and outlaws preyed on peasant communities that had no protection from robbery and violence. Desperate men who had lost their land or been forced from their communities formed gangs that attacked travelers, raided villages, and kidnapped peasants for ransom. The roads were dangerous, making travel risky and isolating peasant communities. Military service was compulsory for peasants, who were required to serve their lord in times of war regardless of their own survival needs. Peasant soldiers were poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and treated as expendable cannon fodder by noble commanders who saw them as barely human. Most peasants who went to war never returned home. War brought devastation to peasant communities through direct violence, economic disruption, and the presence of armed soldiers who viewed peasant property as legitimate targets for looting. Armies would strip the countryside of food, animals, and valuable goods, leaving peasant families destitute and starving in the aftermath of military campaigns. Criminal justice was administered by the same lords who oppressed peasants in every other aspect of their lives. Punishments were designed to be public spectacles that reinforced social hierarchy rather than fair responses to wrongdoing. Peasants accused of crimes had no right to legal representation and were often tortured until they confessed to whatever charges were brought against them. Executions were common and brutal, involving methods like hanging, burning, drowning, or being torn apart by horses. These public events were entertainment for the community and warnings to potential criminals, but they also traumatized populations that were already dealing with violence and death as regular parts of life. Mutilation was used as punishment for theft and other property crimes, with convicted criminals losing hands, fingers, ears, or eyes. These permanent marks identified them as criminals for life, making it impossible to reintegrate into society and often forcing them into continued criminal behavior as their only means of survival. Sexual violence against peasant women was common and rarely punished, particularly when the perpetrators were from higher social classes. Lords and their retainers could abuse peasant women with impunity, while peasant men had no legal recourse and could be punished for attempting to defend their wives or daughters. Vigilante justice emerged in communities where official law enforcement was absent or corrupt. Peasants would form mobs to punish suspected criminals, often targeting innocent people based on rumors or personal disputes. These extrajudicial killings created additional cycles of violence and revenge that made peasant communities even more dangerous. Sanctuary laws allowed criminals to claim protection in churches, creating situations where violent offenders could escape punishment by reaching consecrated ground. This system protected some innocent people from false accusations, but it also allowed genuine criminals to avoid justice and continue threatening peasant communities. Legal systems favored the wealthy and powerful, making it virtually impossible for peasants to seek justice against their social superiors. Courts were expensive, judges were biased, and witnesses could be intimidated or bribed. Peasants learned that law was another tool of oppression rather than a source of protection or fairness. Chapter 10. Women's Lives, Extra Suffering with No Extra Benefits. If being a medieval peasant was difficult, being a female medieval peasant was like playing the same terrible game but with additional handicaps and fewer opportunities to win. Women faced all the same hardships as men while dealing with gender-specific disadvantages that made their already miserable lives even worse. Marriage for peasant women was essentially a business transaction where they were the commodity being sold. Girls were married off as young as 12 to men chosen by their fathers, with no consideration for personal preference, compatibility, or even basic safety. The marriage arrangement was designed to benefit families economically rather than create happiness for the individuals involved. Childbirth was a death sentence that women faced repeatedly throughout their reproductive years. Without medical knowledge, anesthesia, or sterile conditions, giving birth was extraordinarily dangerous. Many women died in childbirth, and those who survived often faced complications like prolapsed uterus, fistulas, or infections that made their remaining years painful and difficult. Pregnancy offered no respite from heavy labor or harsh working conditions. Pregnant peasant women continued working in the fields, carrying heavy loads, and performing physical labor right up until they went into labor. There was no concept of prenatal care, maternity leave, or protecting expectant mothers from dangerous work. Domestic violence was accepted as a husband's right to discipline his wife. Women had no legal protection from abusive spouses and no recourse when violence occurred. The church and legal system reinforced male authority over women, teaching that wives should submit to their husbands even when that submission involved physical harm. Economic dependence was total for peasant women, who couldn't own property, enter contracts, or engage in business independently. Everything a woman earned or inherited technically belonged to her husband or male relatives. This created a system where women had no financial security and no ability to escape abusive or unhappy situations. Legal rights for women were virtually non-existent. Women couldn't testify in court against men, couldn't bring legal cases independently, and were excluded from most legal processes. When women were accused of crimes, they faced the same brutal punishments as men but with less chance of fair treatment or mercy. Work expectations for women included all the agricultural labor required of peasant men, plus additional responsibilities for childcare, cooking, cleaning, textile production, and household management. Women worked longer hours than men while receiving less food, less respect, and fewer opportunities for rest or recreation. Health care for women was particularly primitive and dangerous. Female medical issues were poorly understood and often attributed to moral failings or supernatural causes. Treatments for women's health problems typically involved bleeding, purging, or religious rituals that had no medical benefit and often made conditions worse. Widowhood could be either liberation or disaster, depending on circumstances. Widows might gain some legal independence but also faced economic insecurity and social vulnerability. Young widows were often forced to remarry quickly to survive economically, while older widows might face poverty and abandonment by their communities. Education was completely unavailable to peasant women, who were considered incapable of learning and undeserving of intellectual development. Women remained illiterate and dependent on male relatives for any interactions with the written world. This intellectual suppression ensured that women couldn't develop skills that might lead to independence. Religious life offered some opportunities for women to escape marriage and domestic servitude, but convents were usually reserved for wealthy families who could pay dowries. Poor peasant women had no access to religious careers that might provide alternative life paths or intellectual stimulation. Sexual assault was common and rarely punished, particularly when perpetrators were from higher social classes. Peasant women had no protection from rape and often faced blame and ostracism when assaults occurred. The legal system treated rape as a property crime against the woman's male relatives rather than a violent crime against the woman herself. Chapter 11. Childhood starting life in hell. Medieval peasant children began their lives in conditions that would horrify modern child welfare services and spent their brief childhoods preparing for adult lives of hardship and suffering. Childhood as a protected period of development didn't exist for peasant families who needed every able body to contribute to survival. Infant mortality was staggering, with roughly half of all children dying before their first birthday. Poor nutrition during pregnancy, unsanitary birth conditions, and lack of medical care meant that bringing a child successfully into the world was a matter of luck rather than proper care. Families often didn't name children until they survived their first year because early death was so common. Child labor began as soon as children could walk and follow simple instructions. By age 5 or 6, peasant children were assigned regular chores like feeding animals, collecting eggs, weeding gardens, and carrying water. There was no concept of childhood play or education. Children were small adults who needed to contribute to family survival from the earliest possible age. Nutrition for children was even worse than adult peasant diets. Children ate last and least, receiving whatever food remained after adults had eaten. During famines or food shortages, children were often the first to starve as parents prioritized the survival of working adults who could produce food over children who only consumed it. Education was completely unavailable to peasant children, who would never learn to read, write, or perform basic arithmetic. All learning was practical and survival-focused: how to work in fields, tend animals, preserve food, and perform agricultural labor. Intellectual development was considered irrelevant for people destined to spend their lives as manual laborers. Child mortality from disease was extremely high due to poor sanitation, malnutrition, and lack of medical care. Common childhood diseases like measles, whooping cough, and dysentery killed large numbers of children. Families expected to lose several children and often had many pregnancies hoping that a few would survive to adulthood. Physical punishment was severe and constant as children were trained through violence and intimidation. Parents, older siblings, and community members would beat children for minor infractions, mistakes, or simply for being inconvenient. This harsh treatment was considered necessary to prepare children for the brutal realities of adult peasant life. Child abandonment occurred when families couldn't feed all their children during famines or economic crises. Parents would leave infants at churches or monasteries, hoping religious institutions might provide care they couldn't afford. Many abandoned children died, but abandonment was sometimes the only option for families facing starvation. Coming of age happened early and abruptly for peasant children, who transitioned from childhood to adult responsibilities without any intervening period of adolescence. Girls might be married by age 12 and having children by 13. Boys would be performing adult agricultural labor by their early teens. Child safety was not a consideration in medieval peasant communities where survival took priority over protection. Children worked with dangerous tools, around large animals, and in hazardous conditions without supervision or safety measures. Accidents and injuries were common and often permanently disabling or fatal. Emotional development was stunted by the harsh conditions and constant stress of peasant life. Children learned early that the world was dangerous. Adults were often violent, and survival required constant vigilance and work. There was little opportunity for the emotional nurturing that modern psychology considers essential for healthy development. Sibling relationships were complicated by competition for limited resources and parental attention. Older children often resented younger ones who consumed food and required care, while younger children competed with siblings for survival advantages. Family bonds existed but were strained by the harsh realities of peasant life. Play and recreation were minimal because children didn't have time, energy, or resources for non-productive activities. What little play occurred usually involved mimicking adult work activities or simple games that required no equipment. Toys were virtually non-existent except for crude dolls or carved figures made from scraps. Chapter 12. The Endless Cycle: Why Nothing Ever Got Better. The most depressing aspect of medieval peasant life wasn't just that it was terrible, but that it was designed to remain terrible in perpetuity. The feudal system created a self-reinforcing cycle of poverty and oppression that prevented peasants from improving their conditions or escaping their circumstances. Debt inheritance meant that children automatically assumed their parents' financial obligations to the lord. When a peasant died owing money for taxes, fees, or services, those debts became the responsibility of surviving family members. This created a system where poverty was literally inherited from one generation to the next, making economic advancement impossible. Education barriers prevented peasants from developing skills that might lead to better opportunities. Literacy was restricted to the clergy and nobility, ensuring that peasants remained dependent on their social superiors for any interaction with written knowledge or administrative systems. Without education, peasants couldn't challenge the legal and economic systems that oppressed them. Geographic mobility restrictions kept peasants tied to their birth locations regardless of opportunities elsewhere. Serfs couldn't leave their lord's territory without permission, and even free peasants faced travel restrictions and tax obligations that made relocation difficult. This geographic imprisonment prevented peasants from seeking better conditions or escaping abusive lords. Capital accumulation was nearly impossible because peasants produced barely enough to survive and were required to surrender most surplus production to feudal obligations. Without capital, peasants couldn't invest in better tools, improve techniques, or business ventures that might increase their productivity and income. Legal restrictions prevented peasants from challenging the system through official channels. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't bring legal cases against their social superiors, and couldn't organize politically to demand reforms. The legal system existed to preserve the status quo rather than provide justice for peasants. Social conditioning taught peasants that their suffering was natural, divinely ordained, and morally necessary. The church reinforced feudal hierarchy by preaching that earthly suffering led to heavenly rewards and that challenging social order was sinful. This ideological control prevented peasants from recognizing that their conditions were artificially created rather than inevitable. Economic monopolies gave lords control over essential services like mills, ovens, and markets. Peasants had to pay fees to use these facilities because alternatives were forbidden or impossible to create. This monopolistic control ensured that lords profited from every aspect of peasant economic activity while preventing competition that might benefit peasants. Cultural isolation kept peasant communities ignorant of conditions elsewhere and prevented them from learning about alternative social arrangements. Without communication networks or travel opportunities, peasants couldn't compare their lives to those of people in other regions or time periods who might have achieved better conditions. Military suppression crushed any attempts at organized resistance or rebellion. Lords maintained armed forces specifically to prevent peasant uprisings and had legal authority to use violence against anyone who challenged feudal authority. The few peasant rebellions that did occur were brutally suppressed, serving as warnings to others who might consider resistance. Technological stagnation kept agricultural productivity low because lords had no incentive to invest in improvements that would benefit peasants. The feudal system extracted wealth from peasant labor rather than increasing productivity. So technological innovation was discouraged rather than rewarded. Population pressure meant that even when conditions improved slightly, population growth would quickly absorb any benefits and return communities to subsistence levels. This Malthusian trap ensured that peasants could never accumulate enough surplus to lift themselves out of poverty permanently. Institutional corruption meant that any reforms or improvements were quickly undermined by officials who profited from peasant suffering. Judges, tax collectors, and administrators had financial incentives to maintain the oppressive system rather than enforce fairness or justice. The result was a social system that was perfectly designed to perpetuate itself indefinitely while maximizing the extraction of wealth from peasant labor. Medieval peasants weren't just unlucky. They were trapped in a system specifically engineered to prevent escape and ensure that their suffering would continue for generations. Thanks for joining me on this extended journey through agricultural misery and feudal oppression. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this comprehensive descent into medieval hell, and let me know in the comments what other historical nightmares you'd like me to explore. Until next time, stay grateful for modern life, and remember, you're living better than 99% of all humans who have ever existed, and definitely better than anyone who had to live through the medieval peasant experience.